All right, greetings and salutations. After some sound issues, I think we've got it all fixed up and running. Tell me if you can hear me. Hello, Angela. All right. Can you hear me? That's the important question. It's having some rather severe sound issues. All right. Can see and hear us. Good. Good. Hello, Malika, Dari, Anna, Terry. Svetlana is here. Deep Sky Dude, Wolfgang is so predictable. Well, it's really that he is a creature of habit, aren't we all? You should have seen him about 35 minutes ago. I'm like in the shower, just scrubbing the shampoo out of my hair. He is literally sitting there in the bathroom next to me at the shower, looking at me, going, "Mao. Like, dude, you can't even tell time. How do you know? How would you possibly know that we're behind here? Mao. It's, I don't know. It's the nature of the beast. Like, how do you tell Monday from Thursday and the difference in start time? I don't know. It's beyond me, but. Oh, good. Kelsey Blaine Gibson is snuggling with her pup tonight. That's adorable. Good. I see Terry is here. Wonderful. And Kathy, I'm quickly scrolling through the chat backwards, so my greetings have absolutely no context except that I see that Kathy has trouble putting in eye drops for some reason. Sorry to hear it. Terry, did I say hello to you, or did I just think it about 5 times? I've forgotten already. Meg Sampson encouraging her doctor to poke her a few more times so she can enjoy it too. Right on. That's the spirit. All right. Claire Bear is here. Good. Cecilia. No, not Cecilia. Celia. Wrong character. I just had a discussion with my mom on the phone like yesterday as to what a real voice is, and Stephanie's character Cecilia. Ruth Sanchez, hello. Yeah, I wouldn't go to the dentist right now either. I mean, I think I actually have several cavities that I need to have taken care of, but I'm not in pain. But I am not going to the dentist until myself and said dentist have been vaccinated. So let's jump in with some poetry. So, Will, did the launch happen tonight? I see in the chat you saying that you just filmed the moonrise above the Gulf of Mexico, which awesome. So yeah, following question was I know you didn't go there with the intention of filming the moonrise or the Gulf of Mexico. Did you get what you were looking for? Did you find what you were looking for? Okay, tomorrow will be the SpaceX launch. Looks like. Well, cool. I couldn't believe that it wasn't the actual first intended date, but they had scrubbed a launch and rescheduled it last week to the 35th anniversary of the Challenger explosion. Now, I tell you, that's looking superstition square in the eye and saying, to hell with you, we are evidence-driven here in our space program. As the bravest exploration of frontiers should be, go forth boldly. So I want to open this evening, it being February 1st. That makes it Black History Month. Now, some will sardonically point out that it's the shortest month of the year. Others will keep the historical retrospective that it is Black History Month started out as Black History Week, so at least we're moving in the right direction. There's a poetry. There is a poet with a very Italian-sounding name, but definitely qualifies to be celebrated as a black poet. Nikki Giovanni, born in 1943. Ricky Giovanni actually sounds a little bit to me like a slightly more rational, slightly less Hemingway-esque Charles Bukowski. Nikki Giovanni said, "Writing is what I do to justify the air I breathe. I have been considered a writer who writes from rage, and it confuses me. What else do writers write from? A poem has to say something. It has to make some sort of sense, be lyrical, to the point, and still able to be read by whatever reader is kind enough to pick up the book." Bukowski would probably say, "Oh, fuck you, I'm drunk and I'm moving my pen, so you're going to read this or you're not." But similarly, they have a few common underpinnings, the two of them. So this first poem is Nikki Giovanni. And it's called, appropriately, Black History Month. If Black History Month is not viable, then wind does not carry the seeds and drop them on fertile ground. Rain does not dampen the land and encourage the seeds to root. Sun does not warm the earth and kiss the seedlings and tell them plain, "You're as good as anybody else. You've got a place here too." Yeah. I'm just looking up in time to say, to see that Aiden is here. How you doing, man? Greetings and salutations. First F-bomb, but who's counting? Right. Thank you, Svetlana. Emily Thatcher says it's not the same watching the shows later. I totally agree. I don't listen to FM radio anymore, just as a habit. It used to be the thing. You get in the car, you turn on the radio, right? And I always felt this sort of ineffable quality listening to FM radio that I knew that thousands of other people are listening to the same show or the same song or the same broadcast, whatever, as I am right now. Every now and then you pull up to a stoplight. This is way pre-pandemic, obviously. You pull up to a stoplight and your windows are rolled down and you can hear the person in the car next to you is listening to the same station you are. And even if it's a song that annoys you, you kind of have to look out the window at that person in the stoplight next to you and just kind of wave and feel this like general kinship of we're both driving carbon-based forms of life, with the other similarity that we're listening to the same radio station right now. And yeah, that's exactly what I love about these live casts, precisely. Which leads us into another poem by Nikki Giovanni. This is called A Poem of Friendship. We are not lovers because of the love we make, but the love we have. We're not friends because of the laughs we spend, but the tears we save. I don't want to be near you for the thoughts we share, but the words we never have to speak. I will never miss you because of what we do, but what we are together. Yeah. Yeah, Nikki Giovanni. Nikki Giovanni. It's got some words. It's got some words. So Celia Day is casting this on a large TV. That's that's awesome. Most of the time that I'm watching someone else's live cast these days, I'm watching on a big screen TV, and I'm separately logged in on a phone so I can take part in the chat. I want to read, two more before we start this evening's short story. There's only one short story this evening for anybody that saw, but it's a good one. And this will not be an epic 2-hour night, but man, am I looking forward to tonight's story. Nikki Giovanni's poetry is really awesome because it's so accessible, it's so readable. It's kind of like what I had said about Melissa Etheridge's music before. It's not significant that, like, she's not a lesbian songwriter. I mean, she is a lesbian who writes songs, but you listen to her music and you just go, wow, this is amazing. Pronoun neutral, not that really matters, but this is just a really this is an amazing piece of work from one human being singing to another human being. And Tracy Chapman is exactly the same. It's just incidental as to the categories that we would, in politically correct terms, ascribe either of those two ladies. And Nikki Giovanni, again, celebrating the first day of Black History Month. Nikki Giovanni is just an accessible poet. That's what makes him spectacularly universal. This poem is called Love Is by Nikki Giovanni. Some people forget that love is tucking you in and kissing you goodnight. No matter how young or old you are, some people don't remember that love is listening and laughing and asking questions. No matter what your age, few recognize that love is commitment, responsibility, no fun at all unless love is you and me. Doesn't that just make you... it just kind of makes me just warm and fuzzy inside. Just warm and fuzzy inside. Okay, so obviously the trick to watching on more than one device, if you're watching on a television and chatting on your phone, for example, mute the phone, have the volume on the television, or vice versa. Yeah, it's Okay, I said two more poems by Nikki Giovanni before we start the short story, but the phrasing of this one reminds me so much of my favorite translation of my favorite Rumi poem. Now, of course, Rumi didn't write in English, but there's something just so ineffable, there's something just so human that I don't know, I've seen very few bad translations of Rumi. But what I like about this next one is there's a very similar, let's just say a very similar emotional and phraseological hook to a very famous Rumi poem. This is called You Came To by Nikki Giovanni. I came to the crowd seeking friends. I came to the crowd seeking love. I came to the crowd for understanding. I found you. I came to the crowd to weep. I came to the crowd to laugh. You dried my tears. You shared my happiness. I went from the crowd seeking you. I went from the crowd seeking me. I went from the crowd forever. You came too. If I said anything in that, if I read anything in that resonated with you folks in the chat, I love this poem because it's so exactly relevant to being in a chat on livecasts. Do you have a friendship that you have made in the chat with someone else that you've only met in chat? I want to know if you've had that experience, and I know a lot of you have. Please say it in the chat. Yeah, I've said many times my favorite thing about this endeavor of keeping a performance career going during time of pandemic when we can't be in crowds and audiences together. My favorite thing is the community that comes about here. So please feel free, call each other out. Say, I'd love to see who has found a bond with who in the chat. This is not a time that you need fear being shy. This is not a time of being perceived as socially desperate for overreach or anything like that. This is not a time that Joe Warren has to worry about saying, yes, your mom, and think it be like some kind of rude joke punchline, because it's exactly the spirit of what I'm saying here. Deep Sky Dude is my perfect example of this. I met Will in virtual reality, and yeah, I mean, I love this guy. I've seen I think one photograph of this guy, and so I think I could pick him out of a crowd, but I could definitely pick him out if he's talking, because I would recognize his voice. Everyone here is free to look through my telescope anytime. There you go. Yeah, Terry, Terry, I also look forward to meeting Meg someday. I have known Meg for years on the internet, and we've never met face to face. But I've known Meg for way pre-pandemic, and I've had many exchanges with Emily Thatcher similarly of like, wow, I can't believe that we've never met face to face. I can't believe that I only barely know what you physically look like. Yeah, no, this is wonderful. Like seeing Josepha and Christina bonding. That's exactly that's exactly it. Paul Carganilla and we were friends before the pandemic, but we've become like close friends since the pandemic because of these things, because of these live casts. Yeah, Oculus Brothers, exactly. Okay, I'm gonna do one more poem, one more Nikki Giovanni, if I can find it here. This one's my mom's favorite, and here we go. Meg, you and Craig have texted. That's adorable. That's exactly what I'm asking. Svetlana has met myself and my mom Pam in person, and that's it. Deep Sky Dude, the moon is in Virgo tonight. So beautiful. Yeah, awesome. That's awesome. And, he's one of those folks that I don't cringe because when he says the moon is in Virgo, because I know he's not about to make some sort of astrological prediction based on it. Virgo is an actual constellation, and the moon is simply in it right now. It's as simple as that. Yeah, Kathy B, hoping to meet everyone one of these days soon. Okay, so this is the last poem before we launch into this evening's story. I think about this exact concept a lot when there's snow on the ground, and I'll come back to why. This poem is called Mercy by Nikki Giovanni. She asked me to kill the spider. Instead, I got the most peaceful weapons I can find. I take a cup and a napkin. I catch the spider, put it outside, and allow it to walk away. If I am ever caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, just being alive and not bothering anyone, I hope I am greeted with the same kind of mercy. I'm just the perfection of that particular poem on the first day of Black History Month, in a time where we are all so excruciatingly aware of disproportional police violence toward black people, specifically black men. And here's a poem about from a black man about not killing spiders. Wow, I've got nothing more to say to just tie that together. I'm also, I should point out, I'm also quite distinctly arachnophobic, personally. So it's it's kind of an extra big thing for me personally to take the time and trouble not to squish them, but to catch them in something that will give them a second chance outside of my personal domain, and some place that they won't bite Wolfgang, for example. Of course, well, it's really more like saving them from Wolfgang, because he will probably eat them if he catches them. That's quite true. But I feel funny about that in the wintertime, because if I put them outside, that's like, okay, if they don't get eaten by a very, very hungry bird looking for extra calories, putting them in the snow is kind of like subjugating them to Hoth, or excommunicating them to Siberia. Or sending them to a trek across Alaska. Which brings us to this evening's story. Svetlana, thank you again for the Fireside Tales. Drinking vessel. So, a couple interesting points about this story. Jack London was, even with a name like London, an American author. And there are two very common themes in Jack's writings. One of those is Alaska. And another one is how extraordinarily well he writes animal characters, which I think as an author in his particular era, animals were usually just kind of more like backdrops of nature. Animals were usually more like a tree that happens to move, if you'll follow. Shakespeare, for example, didn't write anything about the common man. He wrote about the aristocracy. He wrote about the drama that happens in the royal courts. But there were just areas that he really didn't cover. And most of the authors in Jack London's era were certainly not writing non-humans in as viable characters. A really interesting thing about this particular story that I'm about to read is you will see that there are only two characters in this, and neither have names. It is as simple as one is a human and one is a Siberian husky. They have a relationship, but they are both clearly feeling, experiencing beings. Another just point of novelty you will hear in this is the Star Wars fans out there. And I kind of expect most of the people listening to these are also avid Star Wars fans. The Star Wars fans will recognize something that Star Wars literally took from the story that I am about to read you. It is so eminently recognizable, we do not even have to set this on Hoth. Whitney Foster. That's Whitney has a very adorable Siberian Husky, and Christina is saying that Husky is Dari, Christina's sister's favorite breed of dog. I didn't know that. All right. When you hear the Star Wars, not when you hear the Star Wars reference, when you hear the thing that George Lucas blatantly stole from this story, I want to say like first person to point it out in the chat wins a prize, but a bunch of you probably already know what it is before we get there. So let's just read this thing. Oh, I love all the pleasant, warm greetings that Whitney's already getting. That is just that's lovely. Thank you all. All right. This is To Build a Fire by Jack London. Day had broken, cold and gray, exceedingly cold and gray, when the man turned aside from the main Yukon Trail and climbed the high earth bank, where a dim and little-traveled trail led eastward through the fat spruce timberland. It was a steep bank, and he paused for breath at the top, excusing the act to himself by looking at his watch. It was 9 o'clock. There was no sun, nor hint of sun, though there was not a cloud in the sky. It was a clear day, and yet there seemed an intangible pall over the face of things, a subtle gloom that made the day dark, and that was due to the absence of sun. This fact did not worry the man. He was used to the lack of sun. It had been days since he had seen the sun, and he knew that a few more days must pass before that cheerful orb due south would just peep above the skyline and dip immediately from view. The man flung a look back along the way he had come. The Yukon lay a mile wide and hidden under 3 feet of ice. On top of this ice were as many feet of snow. It was all pure white, rolling in gentle undulations where the ice jams of the freeze-up had formed. North and south, as far as the eye could see, it was unbroken white, save for a dark hairline that curved and twisted from around the spruce-covered island to the south, and that curved and twisted away into the north, where it disappeared behind another spruce-covered island. This dark hairline was the trail, the main trail that led south 500 miles to Chilkoot Path, Dyea, Saltwater, and that led north 70 miles to Dawson, and still on to the north another 1,000 miles to Nulato, and finally to St. Michael on the Bering Sea. 1,000 miles and a 500 more. But for all this, the mysterious far-reaching hairline trail, the absence of sun from the sky, the tremendous cold, and the strangeness and weirdness of it all made no impression on the man. It was not because he was long used to it. No, he was a newcomer in the land, a Chichiquo, and this was his first winter. The trouble with him was that he was without imagination. He was quick and alert in the things of life, but only in the things and not in the significances. 50 degrees below zero meant 80-odd degrees of frost. Such fact impressed him as being cold and uncomfortable, and that was all. It did not lead him to meditate upon his frailty as a creature of temperature and upon man's frailty in general, able only to live within certain narrow limits of heat and cold, and from there on it did not lead him to the conjectural field of immortality and man's place in the universe. Now, 50 degrees below zero stood for a bite of frost that hurt and must be guarded against by the use of mittens, ear flaps, warm moccasins, and thick socks. 50 degrees below zero was to him just precisely 50 degrees below zero. But there should be anything more to it than that was a thought that just never even entered his head. As he turned to go on, he spat speculatively. It was a sharp, explosive crackle that startled him. He spat again. And again, in the air, before it could fall to the snow, the spittle cracked. He knew that at 50 below, spittle cracked on the snow. But this spittle had cracked in the air. Undoubtedly, it was colder than 50 below. How much colder? He did not know, but the temperature did not matter. He was bound for the old claim on the left fork of Henderson Creek, where the boys were already. They had come across the divide from the Indian Creek County, while he had come the roundabout way to take a look at the possibilities of getting out logs in the spring from the islands in the Yukon. He would be into the camp by 6 o'clock. A bit after dark, it was true, but the boys would be there, a fire would be going, and a hot supper would be ready. As for lunch, he pressed his hand against the protruding bundle under his jacket. It was also under his shirt, wrapped in a handkerchief and lying against the naked skin. It was the only way to keep the biscuits from freezing. He smiled agreeably to himself as he thought of those biscuits, each cut open and sopped in bacon grease, and each enclosing a generous slice of fried bacon. He plunged in among the big spruce trees. The trail. It was faint. A foot of snow had fallen since the last sled had passed over, and he was glad he was without a sled, traveling light. In fact, he carried nothing but the lunch wrapped in the handkerchief. He was surprised, however, at the cold. I certainly was cold, he concluded, as he rubbed his numb nose and cheekbones with his mittened hands. He was a warm, whiskered man, but the hair on his face did not protect the high cheekbones and the eager nose that thrust itself aggressively into the frosty air. At the man's heels trotted a dog. A big native husky, the proper wolf dog, gray-coated without any visible or temperamental difference from its brother, the wild wolf. The animal was depressed by the tremendous cold. It knew that it was no time for traveling. Its instincts told it a truer tale than was told to the man by the man's judgment. And in reality, it was not merely colder than 50 below zero. It was colder than 60 below, than 70 below. It was 75 below zero. Since the freezing point is 32 above zero, it meant that 107 degrees of frost existed. Now, the dog didn't know anything about thermometers. Possibly in its brain, there was no sharp consciousness of a condition of very cold, such as was in the man's brain. But the brute had its instinct. It experienced a vague but menacing apprehension that subdued it and made it slink along at the man's heels. And that made it question eagerly every unusual movement of the man, as if expecting him to go into camp or to seek shelter somewhere and build a fire. The dog had learned to fire, and it wanted fire, or else to burrow under the snow and cuddle its warmth away from the air. The frozen moisture of its breathing had settled on its fur in a fine powder of frost, and especially were its jowls, muzzle, and eyelashes whitened by its crystallized breath. The man's red beard and mustache were likewise frosted, but more solidly. The deposit taking the form of ice and increasing with every warm, moist breath he exhaled. Also, the man was chewing tobacco, and the muzzle of ice held his lips so rigidly that he was unable to clear his chin when he expelled the juice. The result was that a crystal beard of the color and solidity of amber was increasing its length on his chin. If he fell down, it would shatter itself like glass into brittle fragments. But he did not mind the appendage. It was the penalty all tobacco chewers paid in that country, and he had been out before in 2 cold snaps. Now, they had not been so cold as this, he knew, but by the spit thermometer at 60 Mile, he knew they had been registered at 50 below and at 55. He held on through the level stretch of woods for several miles, crossed a wide flat of stones, and dropped down the bank to a frozen bed of a small stream. This was Henderson Creek. And he knew Henderson Creek was 10 miles from the Forks. He looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. He was making 4 miles an hour, and he calculated that he would arrive at the Forks at 12:30. He decided to celebrate that event by eating his lunch there. The dog dropped in again at his heels with a tail drooping discouragement as the man swung along the creek bed. The furrow of the old sled trail was plainly visible, but a dozen inches of snow covered the marks of the last runners. In a month, no man had come up or down that silent creek. The man held steadily on. He was not much given to thinking, and just then, particularly, he had nothing to think about save that he would eat lunch at the Forks, and that at 6 o'clock he would be in camp with the boys. There was nobody to talk to, and if there had been, well, speech would have been impossible because of the ice muzzle on his mouth. So he continued monotonously to chew tobacco and to increase the length of his amber beard. Once in a while, the thought reiterated itself that it was very cold and that he had never experienced such cold. As he walked along, he rubbed his cheekbones and nose with the back of his mittened hand. He did this automatically, now again changing hands, but rub as he would, the instant he stopped, his cheekbones went numb, and the following instant, the end of his nose also went numb. He was sure to frost his cheeks. He knew that and experienced a pain of regret that he had not devised a nose strap of the sort Bud wore in cold snaps. Such a strap, you see, it passed along the cheeks as well
And, it saved him frostbite. But it didn't matter much, after all. What were frosted cheeks? It was a bit painful, that was all. They were never serious. Empty as the man's mind was of thoughts, he was keenly observant. And he noticed the changes in the creek. The curves and bends and timber jams, and always he noticed sharply where he placed his feet. Once, coming around a bend, he shied abruptly like a startled horse, curving away from the place where he had been walking and retreated several paces back along the trail. So the creek, he knew, was frozen clear to the bottom. No creek would contain water in that Arctic winter. But he knew also that there were springs that bubbled out from the hillsides and ran along under the snow and on top the ice of the creek. He knew that the coldest snaps never froze these springs. And he knew likewise their danger. They were traps. They hid pools of water under the snow that might be 3 inches deep or 3 feet. Sometimes a skin of ice half an inch thick covered them, and in turn was covered by the snow. Sometimes there were alternate layers of water and ice skin, so that when one broke through, he kept on breaking through for a while, sometimes wetting himself to the waist. That was why he had shied in such panic. He felt the give under his feet and heard the crackle of a snow-hidden ice skin. And to get his feet wet in such temperature meant trouble and danger. At the very least, it meant delay, for he'd be forced to stop and build a fire, and under its protection, to bare his feet while he dried his socks in moccasins. He stood and studied the creek bed and its banks, and decided that the flow of water came from the right. He reflected a while, rubbing his nose and his cheeks, then skirted to the left, stepping gingerly and testing the footing for each step. Once clear of the danger, he took a fresh chew of tobacco and swung along at his 4-mile gait. In the course of the next 2 hours, he came upon several similar traps. Usually the snow above the hidden pools had a sunken, candied appearance that advertised the danger. Once again, however, he had a close call, and once suspecting the danger, he compelled the dog to go on in front. The dog did not want to go. It hung back until the man shoved it forward, and then it went quickly across the white, unbroken surface. Suddenly it broke through, floundering to one side, and it got away to firmer footing. It had wet its forefeet and legs, and almost immediately the water that clung to it turned to ice. It made quick efforts to lick the ice off its legs, then dropped down in the snow and began to bite out the ice that it had formed between the toes. This was a matter of instinct. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. Now, it did not know this. It merely obeyed the mysterious prompting that arose from the deep crypts of its being. But the man knew, having achieved a judgment on the subject, and he removed the mitten from his right hand and helped tear out the ice particles. He did not expose his fingers more than a minute, and was astonished at the swift numbness that smote them. It certainly was cold. He pulled on the mitten hastily and beat the hand savagely across his chest. It's 12 o'clock. The day was its brightest. Yet, the sun was too far south on its winter journey to clear the horizon. The bulge of the earth intervened between it and Henderson Creek, where the man walked under a clear sky at noon and cast no shadow. At 12:30, to the minute, he arrived at the forks of the creek. He was pleased at the speed he had made. If he kept it up, he'd certainly be with the boys by 6. He unbuttoned his jacket and shirt and drew forth his lunch. The action consumed no more than a quarter of a minute. Yet in that brief moment, the numbness laid hold of the exposed fingers. He did not put the mitten on, but instead struck the fingers a dozen sharp smashes against his leg. Then he sat down on a snow-covered log to eat. The sting that followed the striking of his fingers against his legs ceased so quickly that he was startled. He had no chance to take a bite of his biscuit. He struck the fingers repeatedly and returned them to the mitten, baring the other hand for the purpose of eating. He tried to take a mouthful, but the ice muzzle prevented it. He'd forgotten to build a fire and thaw out, so he chuckled at his foolishness. And as he chuckled, he noticed the numbness creeping into the exposed fingers. Also, he noted that the stinging which had first come to his toes when he sat down was already passing away. He wondered whether the toes were warm or numb. He moved them inside the moccasins and decided, they were numb. He pulled the mitten on hurriedly and stood up. He was a bit frightened. He stamped up and down till the stinging returned into the feet. It certainly was cold, was his thought. That man from Sulphur Creek had spoken the truth when telling how cold it sometimes got in the country, and he had laughed at him at the time. That showed one must not be too sure of things. There was no mistake about it. It was cold. He strode up and down, stamping his feet and threshing his arms until reassured by the returning warmth. Then he got out the matches and proceeded to make a fire. From the undergrowth, where high water of the previous spring had lodged a supply of seasoned twigs, he got his firewood. Working carefully from a small beginning, he soon had a roaring fire, over which he thawed the ice from his face, and in the protection of which he ate his biscuits. For the moment, the cold of space was outwitted. The dog took satisfaction in the fire, stretching out close enough for the warmth and far enough away to escape being singed. That's a particular aspect Wolfgang here is still working on in his twilight golden years here. He burned off his eyebrows just 3 weeks ago by fire. Bright guy, though. When the man had finished, he filled his pipe and took his comfortable time over a smoke. Then he pulled on his mittens, settled the ear flaps of his cap firmly about his ears, and took the creek trail up the left fork. The dog was disappointed and yearned back toward the fire. This man did not know cold. Possibly all the generations of his ancestry had been ignorant of cold, of real cold, of cold 107 degrees below freezing point. But the dog knew. All its ancestry knew, and it had inherited the knowledge. And it knew that it was not good to walk abroad in such fearful cold. It was the time to lie snug in a hole in the snow and wait for a curtain of cloud to be drawn across the face of outer space whence this cold came. On the other hand, There was no keen intimacy between the dog and this man. The one was the toil slave of the other, and the only caresses it had ever received were the caresses of the whiplash and of harsh and menacing throat sounds that threatened the whiplash. The dog made no effort to communicate its apprehension to the man. It was not concerned in the welfare of the man. It was for its own sake that it yearned back toward the fire. But the man whistled and spoke to it with the sound of whiplashes, and the dog swung in at the man's heels and followed after. The man took a chew of tobacco and proceeded to start over a new amber beard. Also, his moist breath quickly powdered with white his mustache, his eyebrows, his eyelashes. There did not seem to be so many springs on the left fork of the Henderson, and for half an hour, the man saw no signs of any. And then it happened. At a place where there were no signs, where the soft, unbroken snow seemed to advertise solidarity beneath, the man broke through. It was not deep. He wet himself halfway to the knees before he floundered out to the firm crust. He was angry, cursed his luck aloud. He had hoped to get into camp with the boys at 6 o'clock, and this would delay him an hour. He'd have to build a fire and dry out his foot gear. This was imperative at that low temperature. He knew that much. And he turned aside to the bank, which he climbed. Now on top, tangled in the underbrush, about the trees, several small spruce trees, was a high water deposit of dry firewood. Sticks and twigs, principally, but also larger portions of seasoned branches and fine, dry last year's grasses. He threw down several large pieces on top of the snow. This served for a foundation and prevented the young flame from drowning itself in the snow, otherwise that it would have melted. The flame he got by touching a match to a small shred of birch bark that he took from his pocket. You see, birch bark is a lot like paper, or maybe like parchment, but a little thicker. It'll crack if you put a little bend to it, but it's real thin and you can light it real nice. So, this burned even more readily than paper. Placing it on the foundation, he fed the young flame with wisps of dry grass and with the tiniest little dry twigs. He worked slowly and carefully, keenly aware of his danger. Gradually, as the flame grew stronger, he increased the size of the twigs which he fed it. He squatted in the snow, pulling the twigs out from their entanglement in the brush and feeding directly to the flame. He knew there must be no failure. When it is 75 below zero, a man must not fail in his first attempt to build a fire. That is, if his feet are wet. If his feet are dry and he fails, he can run along the trail for half a mile and restore his circulation. But the circulation of wet and freezing feet cannot be restored by running when it is 75 below. No matter how fast he runs, the wet feet will freeze all the harder. All this the man knew. The old timer on Sulphur Creek had told him about it the previous fall, and now he was appreciating that advice. Really, already all sensation had gone out of his feet. To build the fire, He had been forced to remove his mittens, and the fingers had quickly gone numb. His pace of 4 miles an hour had kept his heart pumping blood to the surface of his body and to all the extremities, but the instant he stopped, the action of the pump eased down. The cold of space smote the unprotected tip of the planet, and he, being on that unprotected tip, received the full force of the blow. You see, even back in Jack London's time, there was no internet, and they knew that there was no flat earth thing going on. The blood of his body recoiled before the force of the cold blow from space. The blood was alive like the dog, and like the dog, it wanted to hide away and cover itself up from the fearful cold. So long as he walked 4 miles an hour, he pumped that blood willy-nilly to the surface. But now it ebbed away and sank down into the recesses of his body. The extremities were the first to feel its absence. His wet feet froze the faster, and his exposed fingers numbed the faster, though they had not yet begun to freeze. Nose and cheeks were already freezing, while the skin of all his body chilled as it lost its blood. But he was safe. Toes and nose and cheeks would be only touched by the frost, for the fire was beginning to burn with strength. He was feeding it with twigs the size of his finger. In another minute, he'd be able to feed it with branches the size of his wrist. And then he could remove his wet footgear, and while it dried, he could keep his naked feet warm by the fire, warming them at first, of course, with snow. That's right. 107 degrees of frost. First thing he can do to treat his frostbite feet is just rub them with snow. That would actually raise the temperature, if you can think about it in them terms. The fire was a success. He was safe. He remembered the advice of the old-timer on Sulphur Creek, and he smiled. The old-timer had been very serious in laying down the law that no man must travel alone in the Klondike after 50 below. Well, here he was. He had had the accident. He was alone, and he had saved himself. Those old-timers were rather womanish. Some of them, he thought. All a man had to do was to keep his head, and he was all right. Any man who was a man could travel alone. But it was surprising, the rapidity with which his cheeks and nose were freezing. And he had not thought his fingers could go lifeless in so short a time. Lifeless they were, for he could scarcely make them move together to grasp a twig, and they seemed remote from his body and from him. When he touched a twig, he had to look and see whether or not he had a hold of it. The wires were pretty well down between him and his finger ends. I say again, the wires were pretty well down between him and his finger ends. All of which counted for little. There was the fire, snapping and crackling and promising life with every dancing flame. He started to untie his moccasins. They were coated with ice. The thick German socks were like sheaths of iron halfway up to the knees, and the moccasin strings were like rods of steel, all twisted and knotted as by some conflagration. For a moment, He tugged with his numb fingers. Then, realizing the folly of it, he drew his sheath knife. But before he could cut the strings, it happened. It was his own fault. Or, rather, his mistake. He should not have built the fire under the spruce tree. He should have built it in the open. There was no wind. But it had been easier to pull the twigs from the brush and drop them directly on the fire. Now, the tree under which he had done this carried a weight of snow on its boughs. No wind had blown for weeks, and each bough was fairly, just totally, fully freighted. Each time he had pulled a twig, he had communicated a slight agitation to the tree. An imperceptible agitation, so far as he was concerned, but an agitation sufficient to bring about the disaster. High up in the tree, one bough capsized its load of snow. This fell on the boughs beneath, capsizing them. This process continued, spreading out and involving the whole tree. It grew like an avalanche, and it descended without warning upon the man and the fire. And the fire got blotted out. Where it had burned was a mantle of fresh and disordered snow. The man was shocked. It was as though he had just heard his own sentence of death. For a moment he sat and stared at the spot where the fire had been. Then he grew very calm. Perhaps the old-timer on Sulphur Creek was right. If he had only had a trail mate, he would have been in no danger now. The trail mate could have built the fire. Well, it was up to him to build the fire over again. And the second time, there must be no failure. Even if he succeeded, he'd most likely lose some toes. His feet must be badly frozen by now, and there'd be some time before the second fire was going to be ready. Such were his thoughts, but he did not sit and think them. He was busy all the time they were passing through his mind. He made a new foundation for a fire, this time in the open, where no treacherous tree could blot it out. Next, he gathered dry grasses and tiny twigs from the high water flotsam. He could not bring his fingers together to pull them out, but he was able to gather them just by the handful. In this way, he got many rotten twigs and bits of green moss that were undesirable, but it was the best he could do, so he worked methodically, even collecting an armful of the larger branches to be used later when the fire gathered strength. And all the while, the dog sat and watched him. A certain yearning wistfulness in its eyes, for it looked upon him as the fire provider, and the fire was slow in coming. When all was ready, the man reached in his pocket for a second piece of birch bark. He knew the bark was there, and though he couldn't feel it with his fingers, he could hear its crisp rustling as he fumbled for it. Try as he would, he could not clutch hold of it. And all the time, in his consciousness, was the knowledge that each instant his feet were freezing. This thought tended to put him in a panic, but he fought against it and he kept calm. He pulled on his mittens with his teeth. He threshed his arms back and forth, beating his hands with all his might against his sides. He did this sitting down, and he stood up to do it. And all the while, the dog sat in the snow. Its wolf brush of a tail curled warmly over its 4 feet. Its sharp wolf ears pricked forwardly, intently, as it watched the man. And the man, as it beat and threshed with his arms and his hands, felt a great surge of envy as he regarded the creature that was warm and secure in his natural covering. Doing all right there, huh? After a time, he was aware of the first far-away signals of sensation in his beaten fingers. The faint tingling grew stronger till it evolved into a sting and ache that was excruciating, but which the man hailed with satisfaction. He strapped the mitten from his right hand and he fetched forth the birch bark. The exposed fingers are quickly going numb again. Next, he brought out his bunch of sulfur matches. But the tremendous cold had already driven the life out of his fingers. In his effort to separate one match from the others, the whole bunch fell in the snow. He tried to pick it out of the snow, but he failed. The dead fingers could neither touch nor clutch. He was very careful. He drove the thought of his freezing feet and nose and cheeks out of his mind, devoting his whole soul to the matches. He watched, using the sense of vision in the place of that touch, and when he saw his fingers on each side of the bunch, he closed them. That is, he willed to close them, for the wires were down, and the fingers did not obey. He pulled the mitten on the right hand, then beat it fiercely against his knee. Then, with both mittened hands, he scooped the bunch of matches, along with much snow, into his lap. Yet he was no better off. After some manipulation, he managed to get the bunch between the heels of his mittened hands. In this fashion, he carried it up to his mouth. The ice crackled and snapped when, by a violent effort, he opened his mouth. He drew the lower jaw in, curled the upper lip out of the way, and scraped the bunch with his upper teeth in order to separate a match. He succeeded in getting one, which he dropped onto his lap. He was no better off. He could not pick it up. Then he devised a way. He picked it up in his teeth and scratched it on his leg. 20 times he scratched it before he succeeded in lighting it. As it flamed, he held it with his teeth to the birch bark, but the burning brimstone went up his nostrils and into his lungs, causing him to cough spasmodically. The match fell into snow, and it went out. The old-timer on Sulphur Creek was right. He thought in the moment of controlled despair that ensued, after 50 below, a man should travel with a partner. He beat his hands, but failed in exciting any sensation. Suddenly, he bared both hands, removing the mittens with his teeth. He caught the whole bunch between the heels of his hands. His arm muscles not being frozen enabled him to press the hand heels tightly against the matches. So then he scratched the bunch against his leg, and it flared into a flame, 70 sulfur matches all at once. There was no wind to blow him out. Hurrah! He kept his head to one side to escape the strangling fumes, and he held the blazing bunch out to the birch bark. As he so held it, he became aware of a sensation in his hand. His flesh was burning. He could smell it. Deep down below the surface, he could feel it. The sensation developed into pain that grew acute. And still he endured it, holding the flame of the matches clumsily to the bark that would not light readily because his own burning hands were in the way, absorbing most of the flame. At last, when he could endure no more, he jerked his hands apart. The blazing matches fell sizzling into the snow, but the birch bark was alight. He began laying dry grasses in the teeniest twigs on the flame. He could not pick and choose, for he had to lift the fuel between the heels of his hands. Small pieces of rotten wood and green moss clung to the twigs, and he bit them off as well as he could with his teeth. He cherished the flame carefully and awkwardly. It meant life, and it must not perish. The withdrawal of blood from the surface of his body now made him begin to shiver, and it grew more awkward. A large piece of green moss fell squarely on the little fire. He tried to poke it out with his fingers, but his shivering frame made him poke too far, and he disrupted the nucleus of the little fire. The little burning grasses and the tiny twigs, they separated and they started scattering all over. He tried to poke them back together again, but in spite of the tenseness of his effort, his shivering got away with him, and the twigs were hopelessly scattered. Each twig gushed a puff of smoke and went out. The fire provider had failed. As he looked apathetically about him, his eyes chanced on the dog, sitting across the ruins of the fire from him in the snow, making restless, hunching movements, slightly lifting one forefoot and then the other, shifting its weight back and forth on him with wistful eagerness. The sight of the dog put a wild idea in his head. He remembered the tale of the man caught in a blizzard who killed a steer and crawled inside the carcass, and thus was saved. So he would kill the dog and bury his hands in the warm body until the numbness went out of them. Then he could build another fire. He spoke to the dog, calling it to him, but in his voice was a strange note of fear that frightened the animal, who had never known the man to speak in such a way before. Something was the matter. And its suspicious nature sensed the danger. The dog, it knew not what danger, but somewhere, somehow, in its brain arose an apprehension of the man. It flattened its ears down at the sound of the man's voice, and its restless, hunching movements and the liftings and shiftings of its forefeet became more pronounced, but it would not come to the man. He got on his hands and knees and crawled toward the dog. This unusual posture again excited suspicion, and the animal sidled mincingly away. The man sat up in the snow for a moment and struggled for calmness. Then he pulled on his mittens by means of his teeth, got up on his feet, glanced down at first in order to assure himself that he was really standing up, for the absence of sensation in his feet left him unrelated to the earth. His erect position in itself started to drive the webs of suspicion from the dog's mind, and when he spoke peremptorily with the sound of whiplashes in his voice, the dog rendered its customary allegiance and came to him. As it came within reaching distance, the man lost control. His arms flashed out to the dog, and he experienced genuine surprise when he discovered that his hands could not clutch, that there was neither bend nor feeling in the fingers. He forgot for a moment that they were frozen, and that they were freezing more and more. All this happened quickly, and before the animal could get away, he encircled its body with his arms. He sat down in the snow, and in this fashion, he held the dog while it snarled and whined and it struggled. But it was all he could do, was hold its body encircled in his arms and just sit there. He realized he could not kill the dog. There was no way to do it. With his helpless hands, he could neither draw nor hold his sheath knife, nor throttle the animal. I mean, if he had a lightsaber on Hoth, maybe he'd have some chance with the Force assisting him, but he released it, and it plunged wildly away with its tail between its legs and still snarling. It halted 40 feet away and surveyed him curiously, with ears sharply pricked forward. The man looked down at his hands in order to locate them, and found his hands hanging on the ends of his arms. It struck him as curious that one should have to use his eyes in order to find out where his hands were. He began threshing his arms back and forth, beating the mittened hand against his sides. He did this for 5 minutes, violently, and his heart pumped enough blood up to the surface to put a stop to his shivering, but no sensation was aroused in the hands. He had an impression that they hung like weights on the ends of his arms. But when he tried to run the impression down, he could not find it. A certain fear of death, dull and oppressive, came to him. This fear quickly became poignant as he realized that it was no longer a mere matter of freezing his fingers and toes, or of losing his hands and feet, but it was a matter of life and death with the chances against him. This threw him into a panic, and he turned and ran up the creek bed along the old dim trail. The dog joined in behind and kept up with him. He ran blindly without intention, in fear such as he had never known in his life. Slowly, as he plunged and floundered through the snow, he began to see things again. The banks of the creek, the old timber jams, the leafless aspens, the sky. The running made him feel better. He did not shiver. Maybe if he ran on, his feet would thaw out, and anyway, if he ran far enough, he'd reach camp and the boys. Without doubt, he'd lose some fingers and toes and some of his face. But the boys would take care of him and save the rest of him when he got there. And at the same time, there was another thought in his mind that said he would never get to the camp and the boys, that it was too many miles away, that the freezing had too great a start on him, and that he would soon be stiff and dead. This thought he kept in the background and refused to consider. Sometimes it pushed itself forward and demanded to be heard, but he thrust it back and strove to think of other things. It struck him as curious that he could run at all on feet so frozen that he could not feel them when they struck the earth and took the weight of his body. He seemed to himself to skim along above the surface and have no connection with the earth. Somewhere he had once seen a winged Mercury, and he wondered if Mercury felt as he felt when skimming over the earth. His theory of running until he reached the camp and the boys had one flaw in it. He lacked the endurance. Several times he stumbled. Finally, he tottered, crumpled up, and he fell. When he tried to rise, he failed. He must sit and rest, he decided. And next time, he would merely walk and keep on going. As he sat and regained his breath, sorry, buddy, I need my hand. I got to turn page. As he sat and regained his breath, he noted that he was feeling quite warm and comfortable. He was not shivering, and it seemed that a warm glow had come to his chest and his trunk. And yet, when he touched his nose or cheeks, there was no sensation. Running would not thaw them out, nor would it thaw out his hands and feet. Then the thought came to him that the frozen portions of his body must be extending. He tried to keep this thought down, to forget it, to think of something else. He was aware of the panicky feeling that it caused, and he was afraid of the panic. But the thought asserted itself and persisted until it produced a vision of his body totally frozen. This was too much, and he made another wild run along the trail. Once he slowed down to a walk, but the thought of freezing, extending itself, made him run again. And all the time, the dog ran with him at his heels. When he fell down a second time, it curled its tail over its forefeet and sat right in front of him, facing him, curiously eager and intent. The warmth and security of the animal angered him, and he cursed it till it flattened down its ears appeasingly. This time, the shivering came more quickly upon the man. He was losing in his battle with the frost. It was creeping into his body from all sides. The thought of it drove him on, but he ran no more than 100 feet when he staggered and pitched headlong. It was his last panic. When he had recovered his breath and control, he sat up and entertained in his mind the conception of meeting death with dignity. However, the conception did not come to him in such terms. His idea of it was that he had been making a fool of himself, running around like a chicken with its head cut off. Such was the simile that occurred to him. Well, he was bound to freeze anyway, and he might as well take it decently. With this newfound peace of mind came the first glimmerings of drowsiness. a good idea, he thought, to sleep off to death. It was like taking an anesthetic. Freezing was not so bad as people thought. There were lots worse ways to die. He pictured the boys finding his body the next day. Suddenly, he found himself with him, coming along the trail and looking for himself. And still with him, he came around a turn in the trail and found himself lying in the snow. He did not belong with himself anymore, for even then, he was out of himself, standing with the boys and looking at himself in the snow. It certainly was cold, was his thought. When he got back to the States, he could tell the folks what real cold was. He drifted on from this to a vision of the old timer on Sulphur Creek. He could see him quite clearly, warm and comfortable, smoking a pipe. "You were right, old hoss. You were right," the man mumbled to the old timer of Sulphur Creek. Then the man drowsed off into what seemed to him the most comfortable and satisfying sleep he had ever known. The dog sat facing him and waiting. The brief day drew to a close in a long, slow twilight. There were no signs of a fire to be made, and besides, never in the dog's experience had it known a man to sit like that in the snow and make no fire. As the twilight drew on, its eager yearning for the fire mastered it, and with a great lifting and shifting of 4 feet, it whined softly, then flattened its ears down in anticipation of being scolded by the man. But the man remained silent. Later, the dog whined loudly, and still it crept close to the man and caught the scent of death. This made the animal bristle and back away. A little longer it delayed, howling under the stars that leapt and danced and shone brightly in the cold sky. Then it turned and trotted up the trail in the direction of the camp it knew, where there were other food providers and more fire providers. Yeah, so Jack London is one of my favorite authors in public domain. You can count. Yea, the dog lived, indeed. That's a thing about this story in particular. I think it was as simple as pronouns' sake that Jack London never assigned a gender to the dog, but the character of the dog clearly has as rich an internal life, even more than a lot of Charles Dickens characters that just come into the scene, deliver a couple of lines, and leave. The dog has a full-fledged inner experience, but I think London only called the dog it for the simple convenience of conveying him means the man and it means the dog. We're not gonna waste words with proper nouns and real names here. Well, thank you all for joining us. Yes, the dog has depth. And I suspect, although it's been years and years and years since I've read either of them, I think both Call of the Wild and White Fang, which, of course, are Jack London's two most famous stories that a lot of people probably read in school. Those are probably too long to squeeze into a Fireside Tales. However, Jack London has a lot more short stories and at least one more about a dog named Spot that I vividly recall. I think that one will be coming soon. So there is no super chat for those of you that are watching that do or don't know how that works. The super chat only comes to channels that have over 1,000 subscribers and a couple of more criteria, for which Google will then retain the privilege of keeping about 35% or 40% of the tips given in a super chat, but which Google then later pays out to that YouTube channel. Here at Hunter's Acoustic Cabin, we are doing it in the old-fashioned way, so popularized by our ancestors. Here in the corner, we've got a Venmo and a PayPal to keep the lights on. However, if, like so many other people, finances are not within your purview, you will not be faulted. I really just, as I said earlier, appreciate you being here and joining us and contributing to the community that we can call us. And no, Ruth Sanchez, you've got it absolutely right. Every bad event or bad circumstance in this plot happened because of the ignorance of the man character. And yeah, the dog was the knowing wise one with generations of evolution shaping its know-how in how to comport itself in the snowy landscape of Alaska. Yeah, the man, Mom points out, didn't have a name. Neither did the dog. The man didn't have any endearing qualities. The dog, I'm not even sure that the dog had endearing qualities, but the dog knew what was going on. The dog knew that they shouldn't be out there, that this was ridiculous. The dog knew that the dog was only literally forced to be there at the end of a whip. And as soon as it saw the opportunity to go find a better fire maker, fire provider, it made wise and took off. And I wasn't watching the chat when we got to it, but obviously Han Solo cutting open the tauntaun to save Luke's life clearly just reaped from Jack London here. Yeah, Meg, that's a great point. He didn't even share his biscuits with the dog. You know, he was a bad human. Right. that was one of the appeals of having a sled that a dog team would pull, is that the sled would contain food for the dogs. And this dude took pride in the fact that he was traveling light and I don't even need a sled. The dog's following. He'll be fine until we get to the camp we're headed to. Fuck the dog. He's fine. He'll survive. Yeah, it's no enduring humanity about this particular human, but a great story nonetheless. So this is where I'm going to just leave the camera running to the fire and let you all say goodnight to each other. Thank you all for joining us, and look for the next video on Hunter's Acoustic Cabin, Wednesday, 11 a.m. And, also, tomorrow night on the Vaudacity Network, after the podcast, I think we're going to try a little experiment. And so, yeah, keep your eyeballs and ear holes open and focused, because something fun's going to happen tomorrow night. And Wolfgang and I will see you Thursday for the next Lovecast. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to say goodnight to each other in the chat. Good night.